So our last speaker is Sofia Ranchordas, who is coming here. So our last speaker is Sofia Ranchordas, who is here with me. Sofia Ranchordas, as many of you already know, is professor at Groningen University in the Netherlands, and she's also one of the leading scholars in Europe on matters of sharing economy, innovation, and the answer of regulation when social innovation appears. She's the author of one of the most interesting books on the subject about the question of sunset regulation and experimentalism from a legal perspective. So we asked her to close our conference about how regulation is reacting to these new challenges. We thank a lot her for being here, especially because she was yesterday in Hong Kong, and she has made a big effort to be here with us today, so we are really grateful. And we are going to close our 2018 International Conference with her, which is also an honor and a pleasure for us. So, Sofia, the audience is all yours.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'd like to thank you for sticking to the bitter end of a very sweet conference instead of venturing into the beautiful city of Valencia. I'd like to start by thanking Andres and Carmen for the invitation and for organizing this conference and for accommodating my schedule. And apologize for not having been able to attend the previous days of the conference, which I'm sure were excellent. Many of you have discussed so far the implications of the use of big data, AI, and other technologies for competition law, or how technology is asking us to rethink our understanding of collusion, the virtues and vices of virtual competition, and new forms of abuse of dominant position. Although I started my career as an antitrust lawyer, my scholarship is now more focused on how technology is changing the administrative relationship between public and private bodies through the lens of technology. I have published on sharing economy, as Andres has mentioned, but today my intervention will not be on the sharing economy or on competition aspects of it. It will actually be more focused on another topic, another challenge, which is actually being caused by the use of technologies in government, and that's basically the use of data-driven technology for smart cities. As you know, nowadays more than half of the world's population currently lives in urban areas. Smart cities have emerged in this context as an answer to the growing problems of unsustainable urban expansion, growing inequality, climate change, and insecurity. Smart cities harness digital technologies, as you know, such as big data, algorithms, and Internet of Things, and now many of them are aiming at using blockchain in the future, and they do so to enhance innovation and they're actually their own urban competition. In smart cities, they don't do it just by themselves. Very often what happens is that local bodies actually establish both formal and informal partnerships with different types of digital platforms to stimulate sharing practices, promote circular economy, tourism, and sustainable initiatives. For example, Airbnb tried to, there I am again talking about sharing economy, but Airbnb is one of the examples because when they actually entered the European market, they had expected that there will be actually already some resistance. So they celebrated a number of informal partnerships with different cities, where they actually try to say, oh, wait, look, you just let us operate and we will make sure that tourism becomes more affordable, that, as Pilar said, the center of the city will have more residents, and this will be good for the local economy, but also to ensure the livability of certain areas. And I was born in Porto, in Portugal, and during the economic crisis in 2008, 2009, I can remember very well how the city center of the city was totally empty. It was dangerous to walk there at night. And now if you go to Porto, if you visit Porto, which I would definitely recommend you to do, you will see that's totally different. The city center is full of Airbnbs. So in that sense, it was actually very good that the city actually decided to engage with digital platforms, or at least like to adopt a laissez-faire approach to it. Because if that wouldn't have been the case, the city center would have died. So in that sense, I do think that you can see that digital platforms have helped cities to see this rebirth of downtown. And the connection between cities and technology is actually a very old one. During the Industrial Revolution, we actually already saw that. And in the age of steam-powered factories and engineering, this was actually visible in a different way, because it was all about making sure that there were distribution channels to supply raw materials to factories and transport finished goods. And we know that nowadays technology is used for very different purposes. Nowadays, smart cities are embracing big data and artificial intelligence to advance, for example, predictive policing in urban centers, airports, to redesign urban planning infrastructure, to improve the reliability of public transportation, or to monitor energy consumption. For example, in one of the most controversial applications of big data and algorithms is the use of algorithms in policing, as you know. This is especially the case in the United States, where if you are a man of color, the risk that you will be spotted in certain areas is much higher, not because there is a human behind it, but because the algorithm knows it. So, and this is also mainly used in cities that actually are smarter, but which also comes with a number of implications, which are nowadays being discussed in the literature. So in this new research project, I argue that the use of technology, the use of data-driven technology is both good and bad. It has a number of potentials, but it is also like bringing about new challenges. So the main argument that I make in this new project, which consists of a number of articles, is basically that data-driven regulation and governance, especially at local level, has become a modern form of privatization and outsourcing. And this is a bit provocative, because when you talk about privatization and outsourcing, you basically refer to realities which are like highly debated in literature and which come about with, of course, many downsides. But that's why I also want to use this this expression, because I really refer to the relationship between public and private bodies and the conflict of interest that Pilar was talking about. And I think we need to see this from this perspective, because people are always talking about how we use technology and how good it is and everything. But at the end of the day, we should also talk about who makes the technology and who is shaping our services, because private bodies are shaping our services, and because public bodies do not really have the skills yet to actually do it by themselves. So this is basically the main argument, the main point I'd like to discuss with you today. So I define data-driven regulation and governance as the broad use of data science, predictive analytics to collect and process data. And this data is used either to inform directly or indirectly administrative decisions and policy making. So, for example, when it comes to zoning regulations, which many of you might remember as the most boring part of administrative law in law school, well, this is something that is becoming more interesting, because now you can use big data to see, for example, whether certain areas of a town are more populated and whether people walk through it. For example, Google Maps has really helped to improve certain areas, because people are told to go this way to reach your end. And when it comes to zoning, people are also when urban planners are taking this into account to improve their plans. But the same is true for other areas of public decision making. And it varies from, for example, social welfare, where you actually have local public bodies using technology to decide whether someone is eligible for support or not. And so they do so not by collecting paper like in the old days, but very often they actually have access to technology that will help them improve the efficiency of the service. As you also might know, the data is collected not only for big data, but also for other sensors, for other forms of technologies. So, for example, in many cities, I don't know if this is the case here in Valencia, there are these apps, it's called the 311 apps, where citizens can provide information about the city themselves. For example, if there is a pothole in the street that needs to be repaired, you can just inform, and the local police or the local services will repair it, or maybe another citizen will actually help you. And this means that a lot of information is coming, is being gathered, free information that is actually given voluntarily by citizens. Another example is, of course, social media. Local public bodies are really using social media to gather more information, to know how citizens react to their own policies. There is a huge investment in political engagement at local level, and basically, for public bodies, it means that all the data that citizens are tweeting about a city is also being gathered, and it can be used not only to report problems, but also to measure how public authorities are doing when it comes to solving local problems. So in my research, I have detected a number of ways in which data is used for public purposes. So some of them are more obvious than others. So I think, especially when it comes to urban centers, you really see that data-driven technologies are basically used to monitor not only the behavior of citizens, but also their energy consumption, for example. And you see that public bodies and smart cities are now able to collect urban operational data on city infrastructure, for example, on roads, on bus routes, but they also are able to collect personal data on citizens. For example, by tracking how they move with crowd management applications, by using surveillance cameras, which in many cities they are spread everywhere, but also by using technology that allows public authorities to distinguish face and gaits, and by making sure that this is actually controlled. Correlated to other elements in their databases. But it's not only about monitoring, it's also about informing. Smart cities in particular use many boards to inform citizens about the next bus, the next train, and we perceive this as being very helpful. So this is probably like the most obvious use of data-driven policy. But also to decide, and this is where it becomes a little bit more controversial. We know that GDPR says that it should not be allowed for public authorities to decide solely on the grounds of automation, but we also know that, it's very easy for public authorities to just say, well, no, of course there was a human who decided. But the question is, how did the human and the machine actually interact in this decision? So in that sense, we know that there are many public bodies. I don't know about Spain. I don't know much about Spain, but I know that in other countries, public bodies do use big data and algorithms to facilitate certain decisions when it comes to social welfare, when it comes to tax declarations. And the question that we always have here is whether this is actually sustainable, because all our legal procedures will be designed at a time when we had human discretion. And it was about humans who had to actually make a decision according to public, policy goals. And the question is whether machines will be able to, decide in a similar way, or whether the human will just take into account the information and do whatever he or she wants with it. So this is something that I find a little bit problematic. Of course, another use of data, big data and artificial intelligence and IoT is, the delivering of public services. As I told you, smart cities in particular are using this quite often to deliver more efficient services, to improve the circulation of traffic, to make sure that energy is consumed in a more efficient way. And this is one of the least problematic, at least I will say for now, least problematic uses or purposes of data collection. But the same goes for enforcement. So enforcement can be problematic or not, depending on whether you use big data to, for example, to do predictive policing, or whether you just basically use it to confirm certain decisions. I will not delve into enforcement because it is a field of its own. But I would like to say something about the sixth purpose of data collection, which is nudging. I was approached very recently by my local municipality, which is now Groningen, and they told me that they had this brilliant idea about using smart money and blockchain for people on social welfare. And their idea was basically that, now in the old days, you had these stamps. So if you are on social welfare, you get some stamps, this booklet of stamps from the municipality. And then you can use discounts to go to the gym or to go to the theater, or you have all these discounts on everything. So the municipalities thought, but they never had the real control about how these people on welfare use their stamps. So they said, well, we'll make a pilot with blockchain, and then we can control people and we can nudge them to make the best choices. So if we can see that they are never going to the gym, but they use the stamps for something else, which is unhealthy and will make them stay on welfare longer, we'll just like try to send them an email reminding them that there is an offer at the local gym or the local swimming pool. And they can use their money, their stamps, in a smarter way. And I was like, well, okay, I mean, that's nudging, which, it could be good or bad, but it's definitely like interfering with their freedom of choice. And they're like, no, we basically want to make sure that they just protect them and make sure that they leave welfare as soon as possible. And I find it's a little bit tricky because, I mean, especially if you read the work of Karen Young on hyper-nudging, you will see that, it's good and bad, right? It might be full of good intentions, but at the same time, it also does constrain your freedom of choice as a citizen. And it also constrains the freedom of choice of only those people who are on welfare. Because if you're not on welfare, no one will ask you how you spend your day or where you spend your money. But from the moment that you actually are receiving money from the government, then you will be nudged to take certain behaviors, which again is a form of excluding, or at least a form of differentiating people who are on welfare from the others who actually can afford not to be nudged. So the employment of big data and the collaboration between public bodies and private bodies, including digital platforms, doesn't need to be, in theory, a problem, because as Pilar said, it just opens the door to a lot of alternatives. It makes services more efficient. It gives us the possibility to rehabilitate the city center. It's full of potential, but it also can be problematic. And I argue that it can be problematic for 5 different reasons. So the first reason is that when you actually outsource certain tasks to private bodies, you are also in a way entering the area of, of conflict of interest, misalignment, the famous misalignment of interests between public and private actors. And as you know, this is a long-standing problem which has been discussed, for decades in literature, especially since the 70s. And it's basically, the problem that when you outsource, you're basically allocating either tasks to experts and you're promoting technocratic governance, which is acceptable. But sometimes with technology, you're spending money, but you're not necessarily, producing really cost savings, because you're trying to make your services better, more modern and whatnot. But these platforms, they're not necessarily really experts. They're just people that deliver a service which civil service cannot yet do. But if with a little bit more of training, maybe they could. So as literature on privatization has pointed out in the last decades, relying excessively on these private actors can result in the endangerment of the public good. Also because this also has implications for the accountability of public actors. And that's what I find quite problematic, because smart cities are greatly dependent on the technology that these private companies like IBM or Google are delivering. But at the same time, it is unclear what these private companies do with the data that they collect. I mean, ultimately, they could be held accountable because they are contractors, so they could be held accountable in that sense. But in the Netherlands, for example, there have been cases going to court because very often, public authorities do not really celebrate clear contracts with these companies. They have, like, for example, for enforcement purposes, they will do like no pay, no gain contracts with them, which means basically that, for example, if you're a private company and if you spot social welfare fraud, you get your money. No fraud, no money. And so you see that it can also be tricky. So the accountability issues are also very problematic here. Also because you know how it goes, especially in social welfare. If you're a private company, you'll do everything to find fraud. And according to the law, a private person can do much more to gather evidence than a public body. And the thing is, they do it. They really try to do everything they can to gather evidence of fraud. And this is, this has been discussed in courts, and I wouldn't be surprised if this would reach the European Court of Human Rights very, very soon. So one of the examples that I have discussed in my scholarship is like when this becomes extreme. So, for example, with Gurgaon, which is like fully privatized a city in India, you see that the privatization has gone to the point where actually everything is privatized, which actually means that the city looks like this, amazing. You will say like super modern, beautiful, and everything, and the citizens can have basically access to all the smart services they can imagine. But at the same time, this is an example that I'll come back to later, because this is an example where you see that the growing influence of private corporations, like the ones that I've mentioned, can also be, can also actually show us two sides. So So when these private corporations manage services like in Gurgaon, you see that you can ask yourself whether there is an unwarranted delegation of public tasks to private actors. So in Gurgaon, for example, everything is done by private companies, which means that the city is next to Delhi, so it's the suburb of New Delhi. The city doesn't have proper sewage. So if you live in a very fancy building, you will have nice sewage, you'll have everything. If you live in a slum, you won't have anything. And I would really recommend watching this movie called Toilet, which, it sounds weird, but the movie is called Toilet. And it's about this problem in India where you have everything if you live in a nice building, but in the countryside, women have to go to the field to go to the toilet because the houses do not have toilets because it's against religion. And then you see men don't have a problem, men can go to the toilet at home, but women have to go to the fields and they are raped, and it's really problematic. And this is actually what happens also here in the cities where they look amazing, smart cities, everything, but because they're being managed by private companies, there is no incentive to provide this basic infrastructure like sewage. And this is it's an extreme example, of course, which we don't see in Europe yet, but this is something that's happening outside our Western world. And so that's why I would like to point it, because this is the extreme example of delegating public tasks to private actors. Another third aspect that is a little bit more overarching that I would like to discuss is the problem of the disconnect between legal and technological framing of decision making. So this is something that many scholars have discussed in the last years, but what you see is that in many countries, citizens still have very limited judicial protection when it comes to data-driven decision making, because civil servants are not always able to explain how the algorithms operate, and just seeing algorithm will not tell you anything actually. So basically it's basically the same, just a mathematical formula actually. And what also happens is that even if you actually are kind of explain how someone made a decision, you might not always be able to appeal certain decisions, because data collection is very often not an administrative action which is subject to appeal in some countries. Because sometimes you actually need to, I assume this will also be the case in Spain, you need to have a piece of paper or a written decision, and then you can appeal it. But when it comes to data-driven decision making, it's full of policies, it's full of little things that are made along the way, and you don't have access to courts. I mean, if you're a public civil servant, you might have access to court under the general law of civil servants, but if you're just a regular citizen, you won't have access to court. And I think this is really problematic, because this basically means that we are giving our data every day when we walk outside in a smart city, but if something happens, if we don't agree with it, I mean, the GDPR can come and say that we are owners of our data, but so what? I mean, we actually don't know how data is being exchanged between different public bodies, how they use it, and we can't appeal some of these steps of all the process. So the disconnect between existing legal frameworks and technology is basically also explained by the fact that local law and administrative law still remains based on the assumption that governmental decisions will be made by humans and not by machines. Humans that have friends and family and that might be corrupt, so you have all these rules on how to avoid, making favors to your friends, but robots don't have friends. So the problems are very different, but we still are governed by these rules. So under certain circumstances, and depending on the jurisdiction, administrative law might actually limit the ability to delegate public tasks and legal decisions to third parties, including machine learning algorithms. And this is something that I think we really need to rethink, because this is one of the main disconnects nowadays when it comes to data-driven regulation. A fourth problem that I'd like to discuss with you is transparency. This is something that literature has discussed very thoroughly. So as you know, the legitimacy of smart cities is highly dependent on their ability to remain transparent and accountable to citizens, and despite their reliance on data-driven mechanisms and their relationship with private actors. And the lack of transparency of the system puts at stake the principle of good administration. And I'd like to note that in many countries, the principle of transparency didn't exist in administrative law until the European Union came along, and and now we have a very clear European law principle of transparency. But for example, in the Netherlands, it was totally unknown. You have this overarching principle of transparency, more in a more constitutional law sense. But you could do whatever you wanted when it came to, for example, like giving away licenses and permits, and you didn't need to be transparent about the procedure until very recently, until like 20 years ago. And now it's, you have this, imperative to be transparent about, how you give licenses or permits. But at the same time, when you apply technology, this becomes obscure again. And that's why I think it is complicated to also solve this, because we know that just shedding light on the procedure, just giving transparency is not enough. You need to also give an explanation and be able to actually show citizens why things happen, and being able to give a sense of transparency that will also hold people accountable for their acts. So a right to reasons or a right to transparent explanation would require that public bodies support their actions with a rational explanation of why they made a certain decision. And reason giving could limit the discretionary powers of public bodies and guarantee the legitimacy of decisions, especially in the context of smart cities. But it might not be meaningful enough if the average citizen cannot grasp the reasons why this decision has been taken. And this brings me basically to the last problem that I would like to discuss with you. And this is something that particularly worries me, because you see that in smart cities, all these public services are being delivered in a very efficient way, and they are very smart, but citizens are also being transformed into consumers. And I have a forthcoming paper where I discuss this notion of citizen-consumer, because public bodies think this is actually a good development, but I question whether it is, because a consumer has choices. A citizen does not always have choices. A citizen has very often one bus operation company. A citizen has one authority that can issue decisions. So a citizen is not a consumer, but it is being treated as such, as an average consumer, and this means that people will be excluded. In a specific context of smart cities, we actually see that services are being provided to city residents that are supposed to be tech savvy, but not everyone is tech savvy. Not everyone is using all these services, and again, this can be complicated because smart cities might not actually be fitting local customs, but they might not be fitting the existence of different social classes and different educational levels. But it also doesn't fit the whole idea that like I said, citizen services are not consumer services. You have one provider very often, and you can't have only one-size-fits-all approaches. So this is actually a little bit of the contrast with the personalized services, because companies have an incentive to provide personalized services. But actually, public authorities, if they are pursuing the public good, very often they actually use technology to provide one-size-fits-all approaches, because this is actually a way of saving money. So in that sense, I think it's important to talk about this, because I actually already mentioned the example of Gurgaon as this very beautiful developed city, but you also have this. This is also Gurgaon. This is the area where there is no sewage, because no one will provide sewage to this area because it doesn't pay off. Private companies won't go there. And that is exactly what you see, that when you actually delegate certain tasks to public authorities, you might have the most beautiful buildings, you might have the most advanced services, but you also can have exclusion of a part of the citizenship, which cannot afford to actually be as tech savvy. So I would like to close my speech. I don't know how I'm doing on time. 5 minutes, okay, I only need 5 minutes left. So I would like to close this by referring to also to one non-legal challenge and a little bit with a view for the future. So one thing that we see here is that the lack of training of civil service and public authorities is still one challenge that needs to be addressed, because civil servants do not always have adequate digital literacy. And I see this also in the Netherlands, where people in general where our governments say that we are very advanced and blah, blah, and we are very advanced, but still most civil servants, when you talk to them about big data or artificial intelligence, they don't know how it works, but they want to buy the technology. So they actually they are basically being spammed by all these big companies with offers to speed up their services, but they don't always know what it really entails. So they are hiring, so many cities now have chief technology officers, but as far as I know, only Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Groningen, and Eindhoven. This is basically 4 cities in a whole country. And outside the Netherlands, I think that most cities do not have a chief technology officer. So this is definitely something that we need to rethink. But another aspect that we need to rethink, and because I'm at the university, I think I should say that, is also legal education. Because legal education is still based on the idea that we lawyers are people that interpret. We interpret the law. While we cannot only interpret the law if we are basically going to be, like talking about technology. We need to understand how AI works, and this is basically, like, with skill and PhD, if we talk to engineers, if we talk to each other, technologists and lawyers. But engineers also need to basically change the way they approach technology, because right now engineers are not incorporating social and social values in the technology they are producing. So this has to be a two-way. There has to be really a dialogue, not only a monologue. So I think investing in interdisciplinary character of education could also be one of the solutions. Looking at what is happening now in different countries, we see that there are some countries that already they are trying to do this. So for example, in the US, New York has now developed a commission for algorithm transparency and fairness, where they really have hired people that check the fairness of algorithms and make sure that the algorithm is not biased, especially racially biased. Seattle is also trying to develop a privacy program that is designed to train civil servants, and the European Commission also has some money available for these kind of projects. But still, I mean, there are many steps need to be taken, because, as I have argued, this is probably the new form of technology, the new form of privatization. We've had it in the 70s, in the 80s, it was all about delegating to experts, saving money. But now, are we really saving money? I'm not sure. We're making it more convenient. It's all about convenience now, and that's the problem. All this, partnerships with digital platforms is about being modern and convenient, but it also gives the impression that we're also being a little bit shallow about our values, because the investment in technology is also reducing, what kind of services we are supposed to deliver to our citizens and the kind of judicial protection they are supposed to have. So I wonder whether digital technology is also creating data empowerment, or actually the other way around. So as a conclusion, I would like to say that I think it is important, to understand that data-driven regulation and policy is both a blessing and a curse. And that's the case not only to competition law, which we all discussed in the last 2 days, but it's just a general challenge for for both law and regulation. And especially can be a curse for accountability, because on the one hand, having more data especially open data, can promote accountability of governments, can actually give us more evidence to work with and know what citizens are looking for, like where are crowds going, where do we need more buses. This is all good for accountability and for better services. But on the other hand, it can also be negative, because we can also use the data for example, for naming and shaming people that do not do the right things, for nudging people in a certain way, but also to segregate vulnerable groups, or to worsen the reputation of the bad neighborhoods. So in that sense, I would like to conclude by saying that transparency is one of the most common solutions that is offered for all these problems, but I really wonder whether shedding light on really complex algorithms will be the best disinfectant. I don't think so, but I'm happy to hear what you think about this.
So, thank you very much. We are out of time, but as long as you want, we can still be here 5-10 minutes and cast some questions to Sofia. So if anyone has questions. Yes, Simon?
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting presentation. One issue was, in the first day of the seminar, we heard from the person about this, how procurement is quite fun in terms of when giving certain services to private companies. They don't actually create value. They are able to create value, but they are not at that same breadth, especially with smart cities. Mostly the contracts are zero value contracts. But at least the idea of the consumer is that it's possible to create value from those contracts, because non-privacy tariffs can significant amount of value that the deals are output. And one of your challenges, I think one of the questions was that they are not reducing costs. So do you see that if they manage to reach at that level of creating value from this contract, your agreement about cost and might be different? And then you also see a bit of a competition angle into this discussion, where is there a difference between how municipalities address issues when they're dealing with big companies or with small companies?
Oh, thank you for your question. Actually, procurement is a good example. So it is true that in many cases you are creating value, and the value does not need to be economic. It could also be just knowledge. So you're totally right about that. Regarding the, so I actually, in a couple of papers, I actually go more in depth into the cost-saving arguments. But I know that there are many examples where procurement leads to value creation. But actually, I would like to address your competition argument, because there is a difference between working with small or big companies. Big companies, they have they very often are the ones that actually they come with certain offers to the public procurement, to public bodies, to the public procurement department, and I mean, the negotiation goes in a different way, right? Because they are the ones who manage them, who actually are able to say, well, it's take it or leave it. If you don't hire me, I'll go to someone else. So there is a difference in that sense. I mean, I don't address the competition issues into depth in my work now, but I see that there is a difference. And for example, something that is more visible. For example, like sometimes with cost management, like nowadays most companies are investing in cost management departments that will check up to the last cent how much how much can be saved, and then they will tell the procurement department, well, this is like, if you want to be efficient, you need to actually charge this price. And sometimes they are squeezing the margin of profits of these companies. They really are, or squeezing the kind of services that are being offered. So this is something that big companies are doing, but I would say more in the public-private sector. So I don't really address it, but maybe I should. So if you have any ideas, we can definitely talk about that in the break or afterwards.
I've read quite an interesting paper from the US written by Sofia Ranchordas. She looks at different contracts between law enforcement and these companies. And at least in terms of the transparency rate, and you find that when the companies are dominant or it's monopoly, they have really range in terms of service, including that they cannot give you any information about how the technology works.
Yeah, no, they're like, yeah, exactly.
Trying to add something to this discussion, which I consider absolutely essential. Something that always strikes me is the fact that we have worked a lot on information asymmetries. And when regulating markets, one of the biggest reasons that we always have considered we had in order to intervene and regulate and heavily regulate a market was the existence of big information asymmetries. And we have done that for decades, and it was completely assumed. In those markets, we are creating environments in which private companies have more and more and more data and information, and the information asymmetry is bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And we don't think that's a problem. And I cannot see why we don't see a problem there, because we are creating the biggest information asymmetry in history. And that appears in this example that you were given, but that appears also in other things that we have been discussing. For instance, price discrimination throughout algorithms. Well, they say, well, that's efficient. Companies are skimming markets, which is efficient. But maybe they are not skimming markets because we don't have the information. The information is theirs. Maybe that's not a skim. Maybe that's only a scam. And for governments and local governments, I consider that we have here a lot of really interesting features that from a public law perspective, well, I won't say public law perspective, as from a citizen perspective, what I want is that all this information who is gathered because public municipalities allow it and creates an environment in which it's possible to do this gathering of information. I think that all this information, or at least the basic information, most of this information should be public, which is transparency, but I think goes beyond transparency, because the analysis of what's convenient is always very tricky, because you have your personal bias and your personal interest, so convenience and expedience is really close. So at least in my opinion, we need public administrations, in this case local councils, that have a clear idea of where public interests are. And in order to do that, they need the data. And they they don't have to accept private companies gathering data without relying those data or giving those data afterwards to the public bodies. At least that. Well, Pedro Telles.
Can I jump on that? So what has to happen is that when a local council finds something, they just find the historic product, so they don't even need to spend the money. They don't understand that they're generating added value for the contractor to perform that job, especially when it involves data-related projects. So it will take a long time to actually understand that this is a problem, and you can actually train people in the field to understand that this is actually a problem. Which then leads us to another question, which is effectively in those contracts, what's happening is that the contractor is being paid twice. It's being paid directly by the council, the money from the contract, and it's being paid indirectly by the people of that data.
Exactly.
Which then they can refactor and reuse and improve their own future bids, or they can use it to develop new products and services to the markets. On that note as well, there's another problem, which is it's one thing for us to say, well, it needs to do that. That's fine. But then there's the question of where do you draw the line and where does the data stop and trade secrets begin? The trade secrets that were developed by the company in the process of doing that contract, I personally don't know where to draw the line.
Actually, that's a very good point. I have actually a PhD candidate that she's starting actually in September, and her research is actually about something very similar because she's actually going to look into how public bodies gather all this data, but how could they communicate this data between them. Also, like in the context of procurement, when contractors are also involved, because, for example, I don't know about in other countries, but what we see in the Netherlands is that each public body will make a contract with each other. So you have, for example, A and B will share data on something, but B and C will share data on something else. And if B and C have different contractors, the sharing of data will be totally different. Which basically means that it's not only, besides the problem of being paid twice, we actually don't really have any idea of how actually even public bodies and private bodies are interacting, because there's just actually no regulation. France has a little bit more regulation, and Estonia as well. But I mean, I think in most countries, I'm sure this is not only a problem of the Netherlands. I'm sure there are more countries where public bodies and contractors are basically just making contracts, ad hoc to solve this sharing.
Yeah, we have nothing. Here in Spain, we have nothing.
Yeah, that's what that would be my assumption for most countries, in fact.
So, Maria Teresa. So, we have come to the end of our meeting. I would say a pair of things before we leave. First of all, I don't know if you have all your certificates. There are some certificates still over there. If you have not collected them yet, please go there and collect them. If you don't have your bag, we have also some bags left. I have told some of you the story of the bags. We are so proud of the bags because we have commanded them to a co-op of women that had social problems, and well, they do a terrific job. Because they receive funds from the Valencian government in order to try to get those women that have had, for instance, bad divorces and that kind of situations to to social activities. And those women who are 50, 60 years old, they have decided, what could we do? What we know? We can sue. So they have created a co-op that produces bags, and so we love the bags. And we have still some of them. I also wanted to thank you for being here and for having been with us those 3 days. At least, and well, that happened to me. I didn't know some of you. In fact, I didn't know most of you because we have created this event, as you know, with this call for papers. So it has been a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to know you. I hope we will stay in touch in the future. I hope you have enjoyed the experience here in Valencia. I hope that the city has been convenient for you and that you have discovered a new city and also a new university, because from today, University of Valencia is also your university. You are welcome here whenever you want. And as you know, we are really interested in following with that kind of activities. We are trying to do it. We are trying to get more funds in order to do that, and we will be in touch. I also wanted to thank really especially all the panelists that we have had and the PhD students that we have at the University of Valencia, who are really wonderful and have done a terrific job. Alba, Manu, Victor, and Adrian. Because without them, it had been impossible to be with you all these days. And also, I wanted to thank especially Carmen Rodilla. I'm sure that all of you know her because he has been in touch with you all these months, because it has taken some months to prepare the event. So thank you, Carmen. And I hope we will see you soon. And enjoy the hours or the days that you are still in Valencia. And if you need anything, and if you have any problem, please contact us. And if you have some forms that you had to fill in, then give it to me. Thank you very much.